Chapter 1. Soto staggers. Another swamp lies ahead. The thick country grass comes to his chest. He mounts his horse. In the suffocating air, he pulls his horse through the mire. Through the distance is a great land, the land of Mabilia. A land that will not return. 1 hour elapses. Soto dismounts and goes on foot again. No man comes near. His eyes grow wary. His beard is old and gray. His pale face slowly dies. He makes a fire. A lazy smoke lifts. He takes out his sack. Inside is a freshly severed head. He places the head on the surface of a stump and stares at it reverently. The head sits still. Its blood is dried and crusted. Its eyes are shut, and flies hover around its broken yellow teeth. Then Soto places his hands on the head, and he speaks to it as if it were his long-lost friend. Good day, O King. It was a good day, wasn't it? The fire dies in the wind. Soto sparks another tinder and throws a set of twigs under it. The fire grows. Soto warms his hands. He whispers and prays. O great King, keep rejecting my every word. I don't mind. I don't mind at all. A compromise. Yes, that's what it was. I knew you'd understand. Wasted, was it, you say, O King? It doesn't matter. We'll have to face it sooner or later. And thou slayeth. Flames. Blood. Rivers. It's all the same. Soto laughs. I wish you knew her, but you should have seen her. She was beautiful. She broke me. She broke me to fucking pieces. A horse rides up. The rider dismounts. Moscoso, Soto's second in command, makes his way forward. Sir? A silence. Then a spiral. Soto nods his head. Sir? Soto walks towards the swamp. Moscoso follows. It starts to rain. He returns to the severed head. He grabs it by its hair and smears its face with his bloodied finger. Then Soto screams. It is the shriek of the ever-damned. He tosses the head and smashes it to the ground. He rushes over, kicks it, and watches it roll down the hill. Then he screams again. The rain stops. The air sears warm and clean. The evening draws, and the moon shines into place with blue embers. Soto's eyes are stained red with shrieks of rage. Soto laughs, and again, Moscoso appears before his side. The scribes, they've returned, Don Hernando. Tell them to wait. Soto walks forth the river. In slivers of daylight, he makes it to his men and surveys. His eyes twitch to the river. His mouth hangs open. He gives into the gaze a gaze which started 10 years ago in Peru. But it is a haunting memory, of which he can only see glimpses. His men march, some on horses, most on foot. There are 200 of them. All of them are veterans. All of them are tired. All of them carry 50 pounds of heavy armor made out of rusted steel and iron. They are slow in pace, but methodical. They stagger, just like their commander. Their faces wince in pain. Soto gets off his horse and wipes off his brow. Again, Moscoso rides to his side. He surveys the land, the swamp, and the trees. The tide pulls in. Here, Moscoso. It's here. Just a little deeper. Sir? Soto smiles dementedly. He turns to Moscoso, then mounts back up and rides off. Moscoso shakes his head and squints to the river before him. Soto rides on as his army marches further. The clangs and clamor of their gear overpower the whistles and chirps of the birds. But what overpowers all is the endless slush of the river, and it runs red with blood. I followed the river down and over. I had no idea how much time had passed since I left the desert. It felt like a year. It might have been half. It might have been less than that. It might have only been a month. I really couldn't tell. But in the dark, I saw every star, and throughout every day, the river showed me new lands of far and plenty, and it seemed to be my only friend. I kept asking myself why I was here. In years past, I simply wanted gold. But now, gold was the farthest thing from my mind. The Turk showed me other things. I learned his lesson. But still, I wanted an answer to my questions. What is this life all about? And why do I feel so empty? Every time I posed those questions, the river looked back at me. I felt a deep and pure feeling that I'd find my answers there. And I heard my father's voice call to me. At the river's end, my son. I felt it deep and pure. I wanted to uncover my soul from that horrible bargain I had made with Satan. I wanted to see the God I once knew. I wanted to feel. And internally, I knew if I reached the river's end, I would find my answers there. As the days went on, I'd forgotten many things. When I rested, I didn't take a step. I just observed. The further east I went, the more the land had changed. The desert and the plains were all gone now. The land was no longer flat. Instead, the country was low and filled with swamps. The land folded inward into gentle hills and repeated over and over. And the river soon turned into streams, light brooks, and sumps. In spring, the lush of green soon covered the land. And when the heat rose and the rain poured, the air became humid and damp. And for days at a time, it felt as if I were in Peru again, and in the madness of the jungle. There were times of peace, and equally, there were times of terror. but I still felt empty. I was alive, but I was alone, and I hadn't seen a soul since the day I left Coronado. At times, I felt like Marcos, convinced beyond reason in something that he just could not prove. And in my mind, I heard the voices rattle, the voices of my past. They came and went and swirled in their own discretion. Some I listened to, some I screamed back at, begging them to let go of me. But the voice I heard the most was that of my father. He had been dead for 10 years, but I heard him so clearly. And each time, it made me cry. In my dreams, I felt his presence, and I saw his red, bright face light up in the dawn. I saw him sing and milk the cows, and I smelled the cheese and wine on his breath. But mostly, I heard him gently bellow out his tune. And each time, he sang the same 3 words. The river's end. My reason. My only reason. Each day he reminded me. And each day, I followed. But still, my mind was plagued by thoughts. Horrible, haunting, lingering thoughts that I battled every day. I thought of all those horrors of Peru and the desert, and of all the souls I had taken. And all those thoughts, all those endless, horrible thoughts of guilt, ebbed and flowed in the voices of the past. And whether in bright sunshine or the darkness of thunderclouds, the voices emerged. How dare you? How dare you, Sardina? What are you running from? You poor soul. You have no idea where you're going, man, do you? Such a goddamn fool. He's just another Marcos. There's great gold in this land. This river is death. That's all it is. Why in the hell are you following it? Follow the river down. Follow the river down? That's your plan? That's the stupidest thing I've heard in all my life. I should have never let you convince me. There's a land of Cibola, a land of Cusco, beyond, beyond. It is Cusco. Beyond, beyond. You'll never find. Dreams, Sardina. When night fell, I looked upon the stars and saw the Turk's smiling face across the sky. And when I stared again at the river, the thoughts subsided. The more I focused on the river, the less I heard. And as I watched the river, I saw it bend and get deeper and wider with each mile. The water was clean and clear and holy. I went in, but I did not diverge too far. And when I saw my reflection, I had seen how old I became. I did not recognize my face. The quiet returned. I felt a tremendous peace in my entire body, as if an angel had kissed me on the forehead. And over time, I learned to ignore all of the voices, at least for a while. This is because the river showed me 2 important things. I was not my past, and I was not my thoughts. And soon the only voice that remained was that of my father's. It was the only voice I wanted to hear. And every time I heard it, I cried even more. The river's end, my son. The river continued. It surged and tumbled and went deeper. At times, I thought it would boil over. But the only thing I knew for certain was that whatever I was searching for was bound to be there. The more I walked, the stranger the land became. Soon, I came across dense forest with enormous trees. There seemed to be a trail along the stretches of vines. Then it rained. It rained for 8 days. More days went by. The rain swept and pounded. When the sun returned, I came across many strange creatures. I saw hawks and falcons perched high upon the timbers. I saw deers and fawns nuzzle at the thick grass, and along the banks, I saw otters swim across the river. I caught fish with my bare hands. Most of the time I ate them raw, because most days were too wet to build a fire. Eating this day reminded me of the people in the valley of the Corazones, and it reminded me of all the time that had passed. But the strangest creature I remembered was a wild boar. It reminded me of the pigs back in Spain, but it was much larger. It was solid gray, and it swung its tusks from side to side. And when it ran, it made an ungodly squeal. And although I was starving, I stayed clear of it. My sword was rusted and about to fall apart, and I knew I couldn't take the risk. Weeks went by. I sat on the banks, and as the sun returned, I wondered how far I went. On one late afternoon, I came across a hill that was blue-green, and I spotted an enormous gray mountain. I could see its white caps and its gray boulders. On the backside, the slopes remained green and brown and filled with moss. I assumed that it went on for thousands of miles. More voices entered my head, but I paid none of them any attention. The only thought that surfaced was just how far I got and how much time had passed since I left Spain. More days elapsed. I saw that the river had split into tiny streams. I paused to see which one to follow. But then I saw smoke emerge from the sky. I followed the smoke, thinking that a tribe was in reach. But when I got to the village, it was abandoned. The wigwams and huts were all empty. There were wooden statues of their gods, beasts and tremendous birds, all carved with such care. The smoke carried on. I searched further. Some houses were left intact, and some were burnt to the ground. I waited. I hoped. And I prayed. But for all those hours, I remained alone. Then, at last, I saw a soul. It was a native woman. She was young and tall. I saw her dash through the trees. I saw her face for a single second. It was covered in dirt and tears. She cried and screamed. But for that second, she was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. We didn't say a word. We just stared. She breathed in and out, and I saw the sadness in her eyes. We stared for another second as the smoke hovered above. Her lips quivered, and her tears rolled down her cheek. But then it was over. The moment passed. She screamed and cried and ran off and disappeared back into the woods. I ran towards her. The smoke grew denser. I choked and lost my breath. She was gone, and there was nothing I could do about it. Again, I took to the banks. I waited until sunrise. At night, the smoke cleared, and she was all that I thought about. She was the first soul I had seen in so long a time. I imagined her face and the look she gave me. And the endless questions emerged. What tribe did she belong to? Why did she look so afraid? Who was chasing after her? And why was she left alone? I left the village the second I saw daylight and veered south. I saw the mountains east when I turned my head, and I tried to recount my steps. Throughout the morning, I came across denser hills. The rocks and stones below were coarse, and the soil grew muddier with heavy sands. Noon came. I went further south. In the tide, my mind had cleared. But then I heard footsteps. I kept looking back, and I looked up in the canopy. Then I felt a deep pain in my stomach. Something felt wrong. Then everything felt wrong. I heard a roar. At first, I thought it was thunder. Soon again, I smelled smoke. Then, I spotted a wooden craft bobbing up and down the stream. There was no one on board. I chased it down and saw 2 more rafts float across in the same direction. I pulled the first raft to the banks and noticed that there was something tied onto it. It was a leather sack, and inside I found cornmeal, dried beans, and a wooden cross. But folded deep within it was a cloth. It was dried and torn and filled with holes. It was a flag of Holy Spain. I held the flag within my hands for about a minute. But then I let go of it and watched it float downstream. I turned away and went further into the forest. The wind turned and the green leaves fell all over. I felt my heart pound against my chest. Then I heard another thunderclasp, but still the sky was bright blue, and there was not a cloud in sight. I lost sight of the river and felt my boots sink into the mud, and it got harder and harder for me to move. Then I felt a familiar terror. I saw a body of an Indian laid on a pile of stones. It was naked. Its face was mauled, and flies had gathered all around. It must have been dead for 3 days. Its head was gray, and its eyes had been pecked out by birds. It reminded me of Brother Luis's corpse, because of how sad and gray it looked. I said a prayer, wishing that it would somehow vanish. But when I opened my eyes, the body was still there. It remained gray, rubbery, and as motionless as the stones it laid upon. I left the body and moved slowly, like a blind man in the fog. I sensed a hum in the air as my boots dug deeper and deeper into the mud. Then I heard screams from near and far. I staggered on and saw a pile of leaves, and underneath it, I found another body. It was of a child. And as I made my way down further another 50 feet, I saw what I fear I would, and as I stepped to the edge of the slope to the fallen tree line, I found the ground littered with bodies. The more I looked, the more bodies I saw. There were hundreds of them. Most of them were dead, but not all. Some gasped for air through the fallen ash. I paced further. I left the marsh and stones. Then I heard more screaming. It rang out loud and dissipated. I looked all over, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I went as far as I could, trying to find where it ended. Then I heard it again. It was an ungodly scream that shrieked from all sides. Then a bright, bulging burst of light ran right across from me. It was a man on fire, and the smoke tumbled like a bellowing storm. Through the fog, I heard more voices, and as the smoke lifted, I saw the faces of those voices appear through the woods. They came in from 100 yards away. They carried swords and helmets. They wore the same armor. And they marched in the same dragged cadence that was once my entire life. Then again, I heard the thunder. It shook the ground. But finally, I realized that it did not come from the sky. It came from a cannon. Shell after shell exploded and shattered the sky. Then I saw a giant oak splinter into pieces. And as I watched the flames ignite and burn the forest, I stood and stared and cried. And I prayed that it was all a dream. But it was not. The men marched on. The cannons roared. And in the fading daylight, I saw more men march about the land with swords in their hands. The dogs surrounded me. They lunged and bit at me, and the men pulled them off. They were all Spanish. They spoke to me, and I understood their words. I nodded and shook my head when they asked their questions, and they looked at me strangely. I walked further and saw more soldiers, but by that time it had gotten dark. They did not bother me. I presume because I wore armor just like them. They probably thought I was some strange, exhausted soldier who lost his way. I went about the fires and saw even more faces, and I stayed near the largest fire and tried to warm myself. A horse and its rider rushed out. A young man pulled on the reins, recircled, and shouted at the men. "Don Hernando! Don Hernando! Where is he?" But the man was not answered. "Don Hernando! Don Hernando!" The men pointed to the trees. The man on the horse looked back. A minute later, another horse came into view. Its rider got off the horse, addressed the other man, and continued to lurch through the dark. The man approached the fire. He held a bloody hammer and hobbled forward. His face came near. It was burnt, pale and old, with scars all over. But when I saw his eyes, I knew it was him. He spoke with a brittle tone. He came closer, squinted, then shook his head. "Sardina? It can't be." The other men looked in confusion. The man looked at me long and hard. He neither smiled nor cried. His eyes looked shattered like broken glass. And as I stared, all of my past, the sorrow and the grief, the sadness and the horror, all came back to me and left me empty. Sardina. Soto. We did not embrace. We did not shake hands. We just stared. His hair was gray and thinning. He looked very much like old Francisco Pizarro in those lost days of Peru. And I could tell he was not the same man that I knew before. Much was lost. Much was abandoned. I noticed his grimace the most. He looked beyond hurt. That wry smile of his had been permanently erased, and a painful rage settled in his eyes. He looked like the oldest man in the world. The silence remained, minute after minute. He breathed in and out. I did the same. He stared at me longer, wanting to see if he could control my every move, but I remained still. We held each other's torture, wondering who would say the first words. And we stared. Then he spat on the ground and drew his sword. He looked at me again, lunged at a tree, and sliced off a branch. His face remained the same, cold, gray, and dim. And finally, Soto said the first words. He faked a smile and drew his sword back into his cloak. Still alive, Sardina. Thank God for small miracles. More men arrived. They stared and gawked. Another man on a horse rushed towards me. Who is this man, Don Hernando? Soto waved his hands, but the man continued to stare at me. At ease, said Soto. He's an old friend of mine. Leave us be. The men departed as ordered. We walked away from the fires and onto a private tent about a quarter of a mile down. We did not say a word. Ahead, I saw more soldiers. There might have been 100 of them. I felt their stares. They looked old as stone. And the further we walked, the less and less I saw of them. Whose men are these? I said to Soto. These are my men, he said. All of them. We left Spain 3 years ago. Who is their general? I asked. He looked. Then he winced. Then he glared. I am, Sardina. He took me to a dying fire. There wasn't another soul for what seemed like miles. We remained in silence. I tried to remember the day I last saw him. It was the day he departed for Spain, and I remained in Cusco. I didn't know how many years had passed. It might have been 10 for all I knew. All that time. All that horrible time. We stoked the fire and put more wood onto it. The wind died down. The fire soon grew bright and large. For periods, all we did was stand and linger in the silence and stare at each other's pain. And when he gave me another look, that of disdain and pity, I knew why he wanted to be alone. All the questions in my mind surfaced to a boil, but I contained my urge to ask all of them, for I knew it would be too painful to cope with. I wanted to know what happened, but I didn't want to know everything. because I knew Soto had become a damaged man. When the fire was warm enough, we sat across from one another and talked. He asked his questions first. I knew I would have all night to ask mine. He asked me of Coronado, and I told him all I could remember. You followed the fool of fools. That stupid son of a bitch. So what happened to him? Did he die? No. He gave up. Gave up? We found nothing. The desert killed our souls. Coronado went back to New Spain. And you? I'm here, Captain Soto. That's all I know. But as I said those words, I knew exactly what to say next. It was obvious and absurd. It was inevitable and painful. But I had to ask it. What brought you here, Soto? He didn't answer. Again, he left it to silence. He drew closer to the fire. Then he took out his sword and let it aflame. But I asked it again. Why are you here, Soto? He let out a sigh. Then he looked me straight in the face. Probably the same reason you are, Sardina. He took out his sword, held it, then let go again. There's another king that lives not too far from this land. I've killed many of them. He went on. Why am I here? I'm here because of the same reason Cortez went to Mexico. The same reason that brought you and me to Peru. He winced and spat. Then he sighed and looked back at the fire. Dreams, Sardina.